Good morning. Welcome to SmartHER News and this week's Debrief. I'm Jenna, and I'm glad you're here as we take a deep breath and take a look at some of the big headlines of the week. We're all about quick, concise, nonpartisan information, but we also need a little time just to kind of dig into some of our big news topics so we have the appropriate context and we understand why these news stories matter. And then as we're getting updates, we're better able to understand why some of these updates are really relevant. We're really excited today because Hollie McKay is going to be joining us. Hollie, as you know, is a journalist, writer, author, and she recently returned from Ukraine particularly from an area where there's a lot of attention focus, where you're seeing Russian forces and Ukrainian forces in really close proximity. And we have news on that today. One of the interesting things about being a journalist is oftentimes you cannot anticipate how different news stories intersect. And if you think that you're hearing a lot about Russia these days, you are. I mean, how could we anticipate this news cycle where we would be talking about Russia related to figure skating in the Olympics and a potential armed conflict in Eastern Europe? However, there are some patterns. You know, if you're looking at these all as tributaries, right, to a major story or major stream of themes of thought, there are some similarities in these stories, some repeat behavior, some things that we can explore. So what I want to do real quick is catch you up on where we have seen the story about Russia, Ukraine, the U.S. and NATO develop over the last week. We have some really important U.S. officials in different parts of the world and traveling today. So we want to make sure we know what's going on there. And then we also have a couple of these other stories, again, when it comes to figure skating, or also a special counsel investigation that is, again, tied to Russia loosely. And I just want to catch you up on those things. You know, it's funny. I had this whole plan last night, whole plan of how this live was going to go, how this debrief this week was going to go, how we were going to dig into these topics. I wake up this morning and things have changed. So that gives you an idea of how quickly the news is moving. So first things first, let's just talk about a couple key developments in what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, the United States. So when we started this week, something I didn't talk to you a lot about were a series of reports talking about a move towards diplomacy, that there seems to be a willingness by Russia to talk and to continue diplomacy and dialogue. And what I was looking for were the facts to actually back that up. But that's some of the news that was discussed earlier in the week. Now we're not even till Friday, and there's nothing of that news as of this time right now. So what we have is a Secretary of Defense in NATO speaking in Brussels. He traveled there as a way to meet with our allies. And you've repeatedly heard this figure, right? 100,000 Russian troops near Ukraine, 130 Russian troops, Russian military forces near Ukraine. Well, today we have a new number. And the new number that the Secretary of Defense is using is 150,000 Russian forces around the area. So that's something I want to flag for you. Why is there growing concern, again, as we're moving towards the end of the week, of an anticipation of a conflict? Where is this all coming from? Well, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, continues to talk about the movement of Russian forces, all sorts of different Russian forces and military equipment. The Secretary of Defense just talked about this a few hours ago. Want to know what he included in his statement? He said Russia's not just moving these big military, planes and tanks and all of that. We're watching them move blood supply into the area, which is a question about, well, are they preparing for conflict? This is what the Pentagon is talking about. In the meantime, Secretary of State is in New York City. I've been waiting, monitoring him to begin talking. In fact, you might hear it in the background if it comes on live. He's been delayed for about an hour. He's supposed to be speaking to the United Nations and the Security Council on this developing situation. This is a new trip. We didn't expect this. But this is what he's doing today before he travels on to Munich, Germany, where there's going to be this major security conference that's going to be taking place. So those are a couple things that are happening. The president spoke very briefly this morning. He's on his way to Ohio speaking about domestic policy issues today, but he had a brief moment with the press where he basically said again that the United States is anticipating conflict in this particular part of the world. So what is actually happening there, though, on the ground? Well, we have some other reports coming in about potentially a conflict between Ukrainian forces and Russian forces, or Russian-backed separatists in an area in Ukraine that's been contested for many, many years. I'm going to return to that in just a moment. So hold that in your mind. That's what's going on with Russia at this very time. The Russians for themselves have repeatedly said that they're not anticipating conflict. And they actually, I hear the Secretary of State, let me go ahead and close the computer. We'll see if any headlines come out from this. But what the Russians have done is just today apparently expelled a deputy, number 2 deputy, American deputy, diplomat in Moscow. So not the top deputy that was there, but a crucial part of the U.S. team in Moscow. Apparently, he's being forced to leave Russia. So this is further decline of the relationship between Russia and the United States. And we'll see what happens from this point on. So let's just freeze that in our mind just for a second. Real quick, I want to talk to you about figure skating. I promise we'll connect it. But very briefly, we know that the Russian figure skater has been at the center of this big debate about whether or not she, in fact, intentionally took a banned substance. She says she didn't. There's others that said that she did. And here we're at that she's still competing in the Olympics. I'm not going to ruin any results at this time, but I think it's important to zoom way out of this particular story and not get caught in just the athletes and the back and forth. But remember, these athletes are competing under the Russian Olympic Committee. The Russian Olympic Committee is representing Russian athletes, but Russia has been banned from competing in the Olympics because of state sponsor doping. So these athletes are actually not officially representing Russia, even though they're Russian, because of repeated cheating. And this is the broader story that's in the backdrop of all of this, because it follows a pattern of behavior. Real other quick kind of tangent, but want to bring it in, and then we're going to bring it all together and bring in Hollie. We are continuing to watch developments from a special counsel investigation. A special counsel is a special prosecutor, a special attorney that's looking into a high stakes case, usually in the U.S. government, although it can be used, that term can be used otherwise. We have seen a special counsel assigned to investigate whether or not there were criminal connections between President Trump and Russians. That special counsel investigation did not show a criminal connection. This special counsel investigation is continuing to investigate, well, where did this accusation of Russia come into interference in the U.S. election? And we're seeing, again, some developments as the special counsel is starting to file indictments of people related to this case. That's what we're starting to see, because this sort of investigation is really, really drawn out. This is what we're watching for. Well, do indictments come? When does the special counsel issue a report of what they have actually found? But again, Russia is sort of, again, in the constellation of this story, because it's the accusations about Russia that are in part being investigated. And what are the political connections, perhaps, to Russia and the United States from a variety of different sources? Is that even real? So here we go to all these stories. At the crux of these stories is, are the Olympics fair? Or are the scales somehow tipped or exceptions given to certain individuals or certain countries? Are the U.S. elections, are U.S. politics fair? Or is someone trying to tilt or give exception to certain people or use certain countries in certain ways? Is world order secure? Or are there exceptions being made for certain countries or certain groups of people? And we could talk about that and whether or not borders are being respected, because that's what the White House is saying. Hey, world order is supposed to be established. Russia, you keep marching into different countries and going over borders that you shouldn't be doing. There's not going to be an exception for you anymore. That's what's being said, but we'll see. So just this morning, there's a report that by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense that there was shelling in a particular area of Ukraine. And I'm going to show it to you because we're going to bring in Hollie. Here's Ukraine. You can see the separatist-controlled area. I want you to focus on that. That's where there's a lot of Russian forces and also Ukrainian forces. But remember, Russia's Belarus all along the border there. So I just want to give you an idea of Ukraine. You see Crimea as well. You see the Black Sea. That's a particularly strategic area for Russia as well. So let's go to what the reports are. And as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and invite in Hollie here. The reports are that a town was shelled by Russian-backed forces, including a kindergarten. And that kindergarten apparently looks like this. We're getting different reports that no one was hurt. Some others are saying, well, 3 teachers were hurt. This is the way the building looks at this apparent time, according to the Ukrainians. Let's go ahead and see if we can get Hollie in here. More perspective of what's going on the ground. I know that was a lot of overview, but Hollie, I just tried to get you in here. There you are. Here she is back. It's always good to see you in person. I'm like, where in the world is Hollie McKay? Afghanistan, Ukraine, And it was quite funny, Holly. I think we should let everybody in on this. You know, we're in communication on a regular basis, and all of a sudden I get a text message from Holly, and she's like, I think I'm going to go to Ukraine. I'm like, I mean, you just got back from Afghanistan. You want to just like relax for a little bit?
Albania. I was like, oh, I was in the neighborhood, you know, just a couple of extra flights over.
That's right. That's right. You were you were doing a couple different projects. You're just like, oh, I think I'm just going to go over there. And, you know, I've learned not to say things like, be careful, or, you know, I just sort of feel like your older sister, that I'm kind of like, can you just check in with me just every once in a while? Just let me know. Can you send me your location status? So we're glad to have you. So you're back stateside. You had to come back stateside. I know you would have, like in all situations, you never want to leave a story. And I know it was tough for you to leave. But why don't you just pick up and just tell us a little bit in your experience, what, you know, how long were you in Ukraine? Where did you go? And what, you know, what did you see? What, just kind of give us a big overview.
Right. So I was in there for a couple of weeks. I was sort of in Kyiv, and then I spent a bit of time in the east, which is where the shelling and sort of a lot of the action has. And I think people forget that, yes, there is this troop build-up around Ukraine, but this part of Ukraine has been at war for 8 years now, and it's a brutal war. There are entire sort of villages that have been absolutely razed, and around 14,000 people, almost a quarter of which were civilians, have died in this conflict over the past 8 years. So it is a really serious situation in that particular part of the country. And right now, you still have several areas that are controlled by what they call as pro-Russian separatists, and what a lot of Ukrainians will just purely say is Russia. However, Moscow has sort of denied that it is directly involved in that, and rather these areas are controlled, you know, by these separatists. But having said that, when you really look at the people that are in control in those areas, and the people that took control of those areas in 2014, are Russian citizens that are very, very well connected to the Kremlin. So it's definitely a pretty easy distinction to make.
So you went to the front lines.
Yes.
What are the front lines? Where are they? And why did you go?
The front lines are in an oblast called Donbass, and big cities there like Donetsk are still under these controls, and then you've got a lot of areas around there, cities like Avdiivka, that were at some point under control of these pro-Russian separatists, that are now back in control of Ukraine, but are in constant tension. So when you talk to people there, I mean, shelling is just a part of daily life. I mean, it sounds so bizarre to us, you know, in the United States, but to go to bed and to wake up with the sounds of distant shelling is very, very commonplace, and something that people living there have really become used to. So it's a situation where they sort of look at it. And when I would speak to people in the streets, and as well as military commanders, and they would all basically say, you know, there really isn't any difference now than there has been for the past 8 years. The situation has remained fairly steady, that they're not noticing any sort of extra build-up, despite the attention that is put on the country right now. So the situation there has remained fairly steady. And what's really, I think, unusual is so many countries you'd go to, this sort of alarm that they're seeing in the media and things would absolutely instill such an amount of panic in people. You would see people trying to flee, you know, getting all their money out, preparing. But in Ukraine, you don't really see that. Daily life is still going on. Shops are still open, work is still on, people still go to nightclubs, life continues. I mean, you still see that in the East as well. In these areas is life just, it goes on, because again, it's war is not necessarily new to them. These tensions aren't necessarily new to them, even though they are sort of suddenly under the spotlight here in the US.
Now, that's why having your perspective is so valuable, because it gives context. We can read in an article that, yes, there's been fighting in an area for 7 or 8 years. But when we see a headline like this, that there's accusations of provocative behavior by Russian forces and shelling, and for you to say, well, listen, like shelling like that actually is happening on a regular basis, that helps us put the news in more context. Have you heard anything from your Ukrainian sources that have suggested that there has been a sea change? There's been more shelling, there's been more conflict, there's been something that has been different than what they've seen in the last several years?
Right now, my sources are all pretty much telling me it is the status quo. That is typical, what we're seeing with the kindergarten is very typical behavior that sort of happened over the past few years, is that provocation where pro-Russian separatists may shell a particular area, and then Ukraine, because you can't exactly always see where that shelling is coming from, the forces may detect, it's coming from over here, so we're going to shell back here, and then that is used as propaganda to say, well, Ukrainians are shelling civilians. And you see that coming from, it's a very much a tit for tat, and it's a very status quo technique that is used, and really used for propaganda purposes in that sort of part of the world. And these separatist parts, the LNR and the DNR that are run by these pro-Russian, forces, they are it's a very unique situation, because they're not Russia, but they're not Ukraine. So they've established these almost little North Korea-esque hermit cities, and all the big brands that used to be there have moved out, and even Russian brands aren't necessarily coming in because of sanctions. So basically, where there used to be a McDonald's is now this sort of strange patriotic Russian burger joint, but it's not belonging to Russia, and it's not belonging to Ukraine. And the same with people living there, usually have two SIM cards. So they have one that will still work with their Ukraine cell tower, and then they have another one that works with their LNR cell tower. So it's this very bizarre kind of life for the people that are living there, because they're really belonging to no country right now.
And that question of identity in that particular area, as you mentioned, is one that goes back decades. That some may affiliate more with the Ukrainian government, and some may affiliate more with the Russian government. But why wouldn't Russia want to take that McDonald's? Like, why wouldn't Russia want to come in stronger to the area? Why would they let these separatist forces continue to operate this way?
That's something that's come onto the table this week, where Russia has sort of finally said publicly, well, now we've got to do something about these areas. I think up until this point, didn't necessarily serve them politically to take it, because Russia's always denied that it was involved in taking the land. But right now it has become a negotiation point between the US. It's probably some sort of concession that Putin may get. And if you sort of look at the situation again, this is also what I think has been lost in this whole narrative, is if you go back to reports from April of 2020, you see the EU saying Russia has more than 100,000 troops at Ukraine's border. So the fact that this has only become news now, it does raise a few questions. And a lot of these sort of Kyiv diplomats and high-ranking figures would say to me, well, this has been happening since April. Why is it news now? There are a couple of things with that. I think the positions moved a little bit closer, and also Belarus was added. So these training exercises that are currently happening, but really they're only sort of 10,000 troops. So the dynamic, again, it hasn't shifted all that much, even though it wasn't news last year and it is news now. This has been going on a really, really long time. So with that, you have to bring in the equation that both the US and both Russia, in making it sort of the tension point that it is now, are both trying to extract their own sense of concession. And if you look at how Russia operates, I mean, if they tell the US, hey, we want the Minsk agreement taken out, or we want Ukraine never to join NATO, or we want to make these two republics official to Russia, but there's no tension involved, then it's just going to end up in the wastepaper basket. DC's going to look at that and go, well, why do we care? But when there's tension involved, when there's a threat, when there's a war, when there's a military aspect, that's when Russia gets to the talking table. Without that, it's never going to get to this point. And so when I think equal to that, you've got Washington that's also using the media apparatus to continue to raise the alarm, and that is the strategy. So you've got both sides that are continuing to, I guess, play their role in inflaming tensions, so to speak, on the situation, because both want to be able to kind of see concessions out of it.
That's very interesting. One of the discussion points we talked about on Smart News on Friday, when the National Security Advisor for the President, Jake Sherman, came out and really made another very, I don't want to say aggressive statement, but it was a very strong statement about concerns that the invasion into Ukraine by Russia could happen in a matter of hours. It was definitely more urgency, a change of tone. One of the things we talked about was you have to watch who's the source that's making that message. It wasn't the president of the United States in the Oval Office. It was the National Security Advisor in already pre-planned press briefing. That's something different. But as a journalist, I have to cover that. I mean, I can't ignore that and say, well, I'm not gonna cover it because I'm not quite sure what's going on here. And so in a lot of sense, the American media does have to follow. We do have to say what the Secretary of Defense is doing. We do have to talk about what the Secretary of State is doing, but we don't want to do it without context. And one of the great things that you're bringing up, which is the United States continues to say that there's a change of posture by Russia. But when asked for very specifics about that change and what exactly that looks like and why there's a heightened concern, they say, well, there's a change. You don't get a lot of specifics. And so it's been difficult to kind of figure out, well, where is the urgency and what to watch. When you're seeing everyday life there, Hollie, in the Donbas region, but also in Ukraine, is there fear by the people in the streets of mothers about sending their child to kindergarten because the kindergarten could be shelled? How would you describe that compared to other areas of the world that you've been?
Yeah, I didn't get that sort of sense of fear, especially in Donbass. Again, people are sort of very accustomed to what is happening. It's not new to them. So I certainly think people are aware of the proclivity of war, how close it is to their homes and to their environments, and make decisions sort of around that. And mind you, a lot of people I know that lived in those areas have all left those particular areas and now live in other cities like Kyiv in Ukraine. But I don't get the sense of fear, and I think that's also what makes it a fairly unique environment, is that it just sort of isn't the same panic you would see in most other countries that I've worked. You don't see there, and I think that is, I think Ukrainians have their own sense of skepticism about the situation too, and they have concerns about the way that perhaps it is being, I hate to use the word dramatized, but it's really the only good word, dramatized, by DC at the moment, because that affects their economy very much directly. You see their currency dropping, you see, talks of airspace closing, you see imports and exports shutting down, and that hits home to the average Ukrainian. So when you look at that, you can pretty much say Russia has won this round, because Russia has, whether they fire a shot or they don't, they've managed to instill this kind of sort of sense of fear and mobilize in that way. So and that's kind of really what they want. And in some ways, the US is playing directly sort of into exactly what they want in raising those tensions. And the other thing that assessment, again, these are all assessments. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say whether these things happen, but if you look at it, I see a lot of rhetoric coming out of Washington where it's Putin has to save face. He has to have a reason now that will enable him to back down. I actually disagree with that assessment, because it's Russia said at the beginning, we're not invading Ukraine. So when I look at it, I don't necessarily see that Russia has to save face. I see that the US at this point, who keep putting dates on invasions and then keep pushing back the dates and keep raising this line, Washington is the one that has to save face right now. They're the ones who have to sort of come back to the American public, and hopefully there is no war, but come back to American public and say, well, okay, the invasion that was supposed to happen yesterday on the 16th, it didn't happen. Now it's shifted to the 20th. And so it just keeps going and keeps going. And so at some point, the American public is going to question, well, what are you telling us? Because none of this seems to be eventuating. And Washington, and again, this is in my just analytical brain of looking at this, maybe their way of saving face is saying, well, we gave Russia XYZ of what it wanted, but we prevented a global catastrophe. And that's going to be their sort of excuse for why they dealt with the situation. But honestly, I think it's incredibly bizarre. I've never quite dealt with a situation like this where you have a world leader like the United States putting these sort of very definitive dates and on a situation, and kind of really sort of pushing the needle. And I have a lot of probably more questions than I have answers about sort of the approach behind this, because you can't be the boy that cried wolf all the time, because eventually people are going to say, well, we heard about this a month ago and nothing happened, or 6 months down the road when things have quietened down, when the attention is focused on something else, is that when Russia moves in? Because nobody is sort of paying the attention. And this isn't going to necessarily go away. I've had Kyiv officials tell me, Russia could add another 100,000 troops to its border and has to have them sit there. It's not that costly for them. This is they put 75 billion into their military last year. It's not hugely costly for them to have 250,000 troops sitting around the border basically doing nothing, but create tension. So I think in that sense, what is the end point in this, and when do we sort of turn away from it? Because there may not be an end point. This could go on and on and on until Russia gets exactly what it wants.
And the question of what it wants and what's the ultimate U.S. goal is something that we're kind of always exploring. What's really at the heart of all of this? And those are some of the questions that you're asking, Holly, right? Which is like, what's at the heart of this? Like, what is a win? What is a win for Russia? What is a win for the United States? How does the dynamic change so that both sides have a win? And maybe this looks different, but maybe it doesn't. Since the forces have been there since 2020. Think about that. That's really the span of the pandemic. These forces have been there. I feel like 2020 was yesterday, and it's not. They've been there for a long time, and I think that's really important to think about. Let's just play out a scenario, because I think with it being so far away, it's tough to kind of think about, well, what is the big deal if Russia goes into Ukraine? Like, this is a part of the world where some of these people that are living there actually affiliate more with Russia. In fact, one of my friends who's Russian, born in St. Petersburg, said to me a couple of years ago when Russia invaded Crimea, that was Russian anyways. that was her way of looking at it. She's Russian, so she has a certain perspective. So, but think about this. If the United States just decided one day just to go into Baja California, the U.S. says, well, listen, it has California in the title anyways. Like, it's ours anyways. Like, way back when, that was ours. We're just going to go in there. We really like that part of the coast. We're just going to walk in there. We're just going to hang out, for that one. No one would be like, can you imagine us doing that?
Right.
No, I mean, we wouldn't do that, would we?
Yeah.
However, just to play Russia's advocate, let's say Mexico decided to invite Cuba, Venezuela, let's just throw in a couple random other names. I don't know, Brazil, some people that have a relationship with the United States and some people that don't at all, just to hang out along the border. Not do anything, just hang out there. Similar the way to NATO forces are kind of along the area of Russia. We would feel intimidated by that. And that's one of Russia's perspectives, which is, hey, our troops are all on our side of the border. Never mind these separatists that are doing some other stuff. You guys are the ones that are moving forces next to us. And we have a right to be intimidated by that. How do you think that the movement of NATO forces has been a factor in kind of the way that this story has developed? And is that an impression that Russia has, that you were able to sense, that these forces being placed by NATO in an effort to say we're united and secure, is that actually making Ukraine more secure, or is it making Ukraine more vulnerable?
Well, I think that, if you want to put yourself in Putin's shoes, you could look at that sort of NATO alliance, and that's always been a big threat to Putin and to Russia, is this idea of, really on their doorstep, all these countries in Eastern Europe being aligned with the West. And so if you look at it from their perspective, they see that as a provocation, just the way that we look at them building up troops around Ukraine as a provocation. So to look at it from both sides, really depends what lens that you're standing on and what you're seeing and hearing, and Putin is really able to use that component to sort of drive the propaganda at home, and to sell the presence of Russian troops around Ukraine, and the possibility that there could be some sort of a military escalation to the Russian people, in basically saying, look at this is what the West is sort of doing. They're encroaching on our area, and Putin really sees Ukraine and Russian as all as one of the same, even though when you speak to Ukrainians, they certainly see themselves as being very different and a different mindset to their Russian neighbors, but in Putin's mind, it's all sort of one. But again, it's how far he's willing to go to kind of make that a reality. And I think right now, any sort of invasion is really too costly for him. He's got that Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and that's his leverage. His leverage is, look, we're selling energy to Germany and to Europe, and without us, they're going to be sitting in the dark. And that's why you're seeing Germany really sitting out in this, because Germans will look at, to be quite frank, they don't want to see the German people sitting in the dark during winter without electricity and heating, and that is more important to them than Ukraine, which isn't a NATO member. So Germany cares about Germans, and much more so than it's going to care about the sovereignty of Ukraine. So again, that creates sort of a schism in NATO as well that the West sort of has to deal with. So it's a complex situation, but at the end of the day, those things are very important to Putin. And if he does invade, as you know, if President Biden sticks to his word and said, you know, that won't go ahead and there will be heavy sanctions, I think that will really just prove to be too costly for him at the moment. So that's why I don't necessarily see any sort of major military movement unless he can create a scenario that says they started it and we're just defending ourselves.
So that's interesting, going back to this report about the kindergarten being shelled. And by the way, Jamie Lee had a great question on our feed about what shelling means, which I want to get to, Holly, so you can kind of explain what does that actually look like. We talked about the sounds of bullets being fired, but what do we really mean by shelling? Apparently, the Russian-controlled media agency RIA was claiming that Ukrainian forces shelled territory held by pro-Moscow separatists. So this kind of idea of like some sort of an event that forces someone's hand. It looks like both sides are kind of talking about this. But again, with your context, we understand that both sides have been engaged in some sort of shelling repeatedly over the last 8 years. How would you describe shelling, Holly? What does that actually look like? I mean, that it is kind of it's a vague word. You're like, people are firing bullets all over the place. How would you describe it?
Varies between contexts, but usually it's mortar rounds. So you're looking, and they look like shells. So there's sort of these giant rounds that are shot. And you know, if you look at a wall and it's got, in a lot of war zones, and there's sort of these giant gouges in it, that's usually because they've been hit from a shell. So, you know, if you're hit from a shell, there's, you know, a good chance that it will kill you, or certainly do a huge amount of damage to you. So they're basically, yeah, just giant. And when they're shot, it sounds like almost like you're in this sort of extremely heavy kind of like massive sort of hailstorm or something. Like if you're in a building that's being shelled, it's this sort of, not only is it's loud and it shakes, but it's a very unique sound of something just continually hitting. It's honestly, it's terrifying. So but usually that's sort of a very standard thing in most wars is most combatants, you know, whether they're ISIS or a People's Republic or a rebel army, mortars are pretty easy to get their hands on. So it's a pretty effective way to kind of wage a war.
So that's important, because while we're saying that the shelling is happening a lot, we also don't want to forget that the shelling can actually kill people. This is not just, you know, you're not just doing it just to distract or provoke. That there is a chance that it can really injure or potentially kill people. And we have seen, as you mentioned, thousands of people, including civilians, killed over the last several years because of this ongoing conflict. What do you think the Ukrainian people want, Holly? Do they want America more involved here? I mean, when you talk to the Ukrainians, because as you're talking and thinking about Vladimir Putin, every politician, whether it's President Biden, the Ukrainian leadership, Vladimir Putin, every politician, they only maintain their power if they have the favor of their people. You know, I know obviously we have very different election systems, but you know, when you think about like what the people want, like, do the Russians want this conflict? Do the Ukrainians want a conflict? Do they want the U.S. help? Do Americans, are Americans willing to put our troops in harm's way if this conflict does go? Which, you know, I don't want to underplay, even though there's a lot of questions. You know, we have a lot of questions about kind of the chaos of the situation. That's kind of at the lower end. The high end of this is that something like a shelling of a kindergarten clacks off a conflict that then really involves a lot of major countries, including our own. So you have this wide spectrum of what's even possible here. And, you know, all of that seems to be on the table, even if it doesn't seem likely at this point. So what do you think the people, like, what do the people want?
I think, you know, I hate to speak for all Ukrainians, but
yes, of course,
the majority that I speak to certainly want to be aligned much more with the West than they do with Russia. Again, that, you know, as I said, Ukraine definitely has a huge contingency of people that would like to be aligned with Russia. but a lot that you speak to, especially, you know, in Kyiv and in the government sort of thing, they definitely want to see themselves. I mean, some of them still harbor very romantic dreams of joining NATO, which I don't necessarily see happening for a very long time. But for a lot of them, that is something that they see as sort of the ultimate goal. And you know, I met a lot of people. It was really interesting that, you know, civilians and volunteers that have all, you know, gone out or own guns at home, and they see that as being, you know, well, if Russia invades, we're going to continue to fight, even though realistically, certainly an AR-15 is going to be no match for a Russian military. But they see this as, you know, a lot of them will even use the term Second Amendment, because they sort of see this idea of what can happen, and a certain distrust even of their own government, which a lot of Ukrainians say they will have. It's always, they never know whose side their government may be on, so they have this sort of skepticism, and they want to be able to defend themselves, and they see that if Russia comes, they're going to, you know, play their part to sort of fight back. And so compared to most of Europe, it's quite easy to buy a firearm in Ukraine. And, you know, even when I sit with politicians, they will say, yeah, I have a gun and I take it to the front line when I go to visit, sort of thing. And it doesn't maybe have the same taboo context that it's sort of developed here, especially politically. So, you know, they definitely see that for what it is, and they'll tell me, look, we see ourselves as more American in this way than even European, because obviously Europe has a lot sort of stricter gun laws than the United States has. But they sort of see there's this movement, I think, over the past 8 years since this conflict began, to really fight back, I think. And mind you, you know, Ukraine has come a long way in that 8 years. If you go back to 2014, Viktor Yushchenko, when they had a very pro-Russian president, and this all began in the beginning of 2014 when Ukrainians took to the streets in protest of him, and he was toppled, and it was sort of immediately after that Russia retaliated with annexing Crimea and then also going into the Donbass region. So Ukrainians went, you know, at that point there were 6,000 in their military. The military didn't even exist, so to speak. You know, 6,000 soldiers that weren't really trained. So now you're looking at a force of 200,000. Certainly no match for Russia, but they are getting military equipment. They're getting javelins. They're getting a lot from NATO and the United States. So it has come a long way in terms of defending themselves. And I think, you know, ultimately Ukraine wants to have that ability to do that. But certainly, I don't necessarily see the United States putting troops on the ground. I think what we're seeing with the US is that it's certainly arming Ukraine and sort of giving a lot of very rhetoric support. But I don't necessarily see a scenario where American troops would be put on the ground, and that really is because Ukraine is not a NATO partner. So the US and and countries in the region don't necessarily have that legal obligation to do that. I think you'd probably be more inclined maybe to see some of the European countries that are right in that neighborhood that may be more willing to do that. But I don't see a scenario, even if Russia does invade, that the United States would necessarily deploy troops to Ukraine.
And the Pentagon and the State Department, the White House has been very clear about that. They don't want to do that. They said they're not going to do that. That 100%, that's not what they're going to be doing. And we can't forget that although the Ukrainian government has evolved over the last several years, one of the reasons why Ukraine is not a part of NATO is the corruption that has existed in that government. And corruption has been an issue for Ukraine for a long time. And so that could be a whole other conversation. Hollie, I know you're going to have to run in a second. I just wanted to see if anybody has any questions for you now that they have you. They always love talking to you. And so if anyone has any questions for Hollie, go ahead and put it on the board and I'll ask her. And as you're getting your questions ready, I guess, Hollie, I'm wondering, now that you're back and sort of reflecting on the time you spent there, what would you say to our audience about how to maybe view some of the headlines, or what you think could help make us a little bit smarter about the situation, because these headlines are going to continue. It doesn't look like anything's going to be letting up. It doesn't mean that we're going to be in a conflict, but it doesn't look like things are stopping. Is there anything that you're noticing a pattern of reporting in the U.S. media, or something that you'd be like, hey, just be aware of this?
I just think deal with the reality that is, not the reality that you're necessarily seeing from the headlines. So you're going to see all sorts of projections and all sorts of analysts that are telling you, well, the invasion is going to happen at this time on this date, and all sorts of stuff, so to speak, coming out of the DC establishment, and treat that, I think, in this particular case especially, with a healthy dose of skepticism, because what I see, and I saw this with Afghanistan too, what coming out of Washington is so far removed from the sort of the perceptions of reality on the ground that, I'm sort of often sitting and questioning, how are they getting this when I'm seeing this, and that yet this is what I'm seeing in the news headlines. So treat it with just a healthy dose of skepticism. Look at the reality that is, not the reality that someone's going to tell you that is going to happen on Saturday. And I really think, for the sake of Ukrainians too, that overblowing a situation doesn't necessarily help them. As I said, they have their economy. The president is trying to make sure that it doesn't instill sort of a great sense of panic, and I think that is really important too. And I see that the U.S. is sort of continuing with that theatrics a little bit, that it's done in disregard to the Ukrainian people as opposed to necessarily helping them. So I just think it's cooler heads prevail a little bit, so to speak.
Katie was asking, what do you think that the U.S. has to gain about the current rhetoric from the White House? What do you think is the ultimate goal? If you could map out, let's go back to that question. This is tough, Hollie. So,
Yeah.
but if you could map out what a win would look like for the U.S. and for Russia and Ukraine, we know that there's worst case scenarios. What does a
Yes.
win look like? What is a win? I mean, obviously there's no conflict, but what does a win look like?
Projection, and I really do hope that in some ways that I'm right. So the last thing I would like you want to see is sort of any conflict over this. I certainly think these are all things that can be worked out diplomatically, and if both sides are willing to do that. So the way that I perhaps would project a win would be for the US and for Europe to say, well, we prevented a global catastrophe by giving Russia XYZ. So that might be Russia gets to formalize those republics, or it gets some sort of agreement that Ukraine won't join NATO for X amount of years, or that the Minsk protocols, which were basically the ceasefires that were happening, that were agreed upon in 2015, they're thrown out the window. So that would be a big win for Russia, to kind of get any of those coups, so to speak. And in exchange for that, the US gets to say, we prevented World War III. That's the way I see it.
There you go. I think prevention of World War III sounds like a win for everybody. We don't want to see that at all. Everyone's asking, Hollie, where you want to go next. I think do you have a plan? Do you already have a ticket?
Yes. So I actually have, I have a long-term visa for Afghanistan. So I'm going to go back there probably in maybe May, after Ramadan. Ramadan is in April. So working in the Middle East is really challenging during Ramadan. So I usually try to avoid it where possible. But I'd love to go back to Iraq. That's on my list, definitely, because it's just somewhere that I spent a lot of time. If you read my last book, that was all in and out of Iraq. And I have a very deep love for Baghdad, and also for the Yazidis and the sort of the Christians and the minorities there. So I'd love to go back there. So that's on my radar as well. So really those two places. And another place I really, there's so many atrocities that are happening that just doesn't get the attention it should, and that is Burma or Myanmar. I think that is a really important part of the world too, that we have some obligation to try and report on. But yeah, there are just many parts of the world. I think here in the U.S., next door in Mexico is the most dangerous place for a journalist to work, and I think Mexican journalists are incredibly brave with the work they do, and so I always try to sort of get there at least a couple of times a year as well. And if anyone has any sort of burning places or that they want to see more stories out of, please also let me know, because I'm always interested to see what people are interested in learning more about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how can people support you, Hollie? You have your book, Only Cry for the Living. Do I have that correct? Right.
Yes, yes.
Okay, sometimes I kind of add an extra word in there, but
Yeah.
it's a beautiful book. It really some of the most incredible reporting you're going to see about the Middle East and really the major events and terrorist activities over the last really of a generation, quite frankly. But also your Substack, you have a
Yeah.
newsletter that you periodically file on that. You want to tell people about that, how they can.
Once or twice a week. It's usually an update of stories that I've worked on that week, or some musings or thoughts and pictures. It's kind of a bit of a mishmash, but please, yes, go and subscribe to my Substack as well. That would be awesome. So that's at holliemckay.substack.com. And thank you, Jenna, for all your support. You're always just an absolute gem, and I really appreciate the work that you do, and bringing me on to kind of hopefully give a little bit of context to these things as well.
Oh my gosh, we're so grateful, Holly. I mean, I think I've talked to our audience quite a bit about, I'm reflecting on 4 years of SmartHER News, and I never would have imagined, like, oh my gosh, we're going to be talking to a journalist, a real journalist in Afghanistan as the collapse is, like, we're going to be able to do that for our audience, or that we're, that, and it's such a confirmation to me, Holly, that someone like you exists, a journalist that I really admire, that's going and doing the reporting on the ground. I would love to do it myself. Someday I'm going to come with you, and we're going to we could do like a trip that like ends with the resort, because we kind of need to relax. I think we've been through a lot.
Fascinating. Somewhere like the Maldives has actually got the highest rate of first recruits in the world. So to be like this, they're fascinating, developed all over the world. So
yeah, so I'll come with you someday. But it is our pleasure to be able to highlight your work. And the fact, I just want everyone to know this, the fact that Hollie McKay is not on every single network talking about what she's actually seen on the ground shows you a lot about where the media's priority is. That's number one. And number two, think about the analysts that are being quoted and also being interviewed. So many of the analysts, and these can be really smart people, they've gone to Yale and Harvard and all these places, and that's so great. They've actually never stepped foot in some of the countries that they're talking about. And that doesn't mean their work does not matter. I love these analysts. I rely on them. But on the ground perspective matters too. And you have to have both of them. You can't just quote people, you have to be mindful about your work. So I am going to grow, we're going to continue to grow SmartHER News. So it is going to cast a long shadow, Holly, for these other networks that aren't, they should be highlighting your work. I get really fired up about it. Start obviously using my hands and but I mean, it's crazy to me. You have a primary source on the ground in Ukraine. Talk to her, she's a journalist. So anyways, it's our pleasure. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate our friendship too that's come out of this, which has been really great, and one of the great unexpected wonderful things that's happened over the last year. So we really appreciate you. I know you got to run and do something else, but everybody make sure you follow Holly. And Holly, I think you're able to X out. I know it's always like a little bit difficult at the end. You like X out. Have a great day.
Thank you all for your support. Thank you.
Yeah, so Holly is amazing, and she's going to continue to do her work. And I know some of you were asking about whether or not she could go to Canada. I'll throw that out to her as well. I think right now what you're really seeing is that you trust Holly's perspective on the ground. And as she mentioned, she doesn't have the answers for everything, but she does have something that a lot of people don't have, which is that she's seen it with her own two eyes. She's talked to people. She's talked to really good sources. And yes, things changed dramatically. I don't want to lose sight of that. I think we've learned a lot over the last 2 years, a great lesson in humility and trying to predict the future, whether it's about the pandemic or Afghanistan or any of that. And the reality is one of the hardest things to know as a journalist, but also in life, is that you cannot rush a developing story. You can try to learn all you can, but you can't necessarily predict how it's going to go, or where it's going to go, or how it's going to end. And you have to leave room for the space of unexpected. So, all the things that we talked about over the course of 45 minutes or so, there's always something else. There's always something else out there. I can't help but think about all the places we're not talking about as we're focused on Russia. We still have to watch what's going on in China, Taiwan, North Korea, Iran, all of these places that also are really big foreign policy stories that we'll continue to watch, let alone what's happening here at home. here in the United States. So I think I really, as you guys saw, I'm very grateful for Hollie. And one thing I do want to leave you with, just to kind of bring it full circle, you know, I'm a huge figure skating fan. I think it's amazing to watch these Winter Olympics, and there's been this kind of overhang of the Winter Olympics because of this question of doping, because of this particular Russian figure skater who happens to be 15. So that's the other part of the issue, which is, unless that 15-year-old is going out on the street trying to procure drugs, there's a question about how this could have taken place. And quite frankly, the investigation is still ongoing. But I don't want you to forget this. In 2014, when this invasion happened in Crimea, it was during the Sochi Winter Games that really the tension with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people hit the streets, and there were massive protests that led to the ouster of this Russian-backed leader in Ukraine. It was just a couple weeks after that you saw the Olympics wind down, and then the invasion happened. So it is a strange thing. Again, you can't ever anticipate how all these stories come together at the same time. But the timing of this is bizarre to think about. Well, wait a minute, we're actually having a question about Russia, Russian power, the goals of Vladimir Putin, what he's willing to do with his military. What about sanctions? We're having the same conversation during the 2014 Winter Olympics. And here we are in 2022 having very similar conversations about Russia and the United States, what we're willing to do, what are we willing to stand for? And ultimately, that is the question. What is the United States and Europe really willing to stand for here? And what does Russia really want? And so this is also why I'm very curious to see how the next couple of weeks play out. Not just the warnings from the White House, but we've seen a playbook before. We've seen the playbook, right? It's one of the reasons why there's an issue with this Russian figure skater. It's not because suddenly she just took a ban. It's because there's a repeated behavior. There's a pattern there with Russian athletes. So how do we learn from the past and make a better informed kind of assessment of what's going on right now? So that's a lot to throw at you today. I appreciate you staying with me, and we'll continue to watch any developments. Definitely follow Hollie, check out her Substack. And as we see news come from, really important sources, we will follow what the White House says. We will cover that for you. We will also be mindful of the appropriate context to any of the commentary that we can give you. So if you have questions or comments about this particular topic, please let us know. And please also let us know what else you'd like us to follow. There's a lot of big news out there, and I always appreciate hearing from you guys. So thank you so much. And a very special thank you this week. Saturday marks 4 years, SmartHER News, 4 years. And I definitely could not have anticipated how this story kind of evolved. That's for sure. And I'm really reflecting on that. I almost got a little choked up talking to Hollie, because I never would have imagined we'd have the capacity to be able to cover stories. And she's really enabled us to do that. And we have an amazing, small, mighty team that continues to allow us to report to you on some of the really big, important stories that you should be able to access easily, quickly, without a lot of stress. The world is stressful enough. News should not be stressful to you. You should be able to go someplace and get great nonpartisan information quickly, and then get on with your day. Because ultimately, what is journalism about? It's about covering the story of our lives, and we want to do it in a way so then you get to live whatever story you're supposed to live, so that it's not a main focus. It's just one of the focuses. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate you always, and we'll have more on smarthernews.com. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.